gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague and good friend, Maurice Herlihy. Maurice is now at Brown. Before that, he was at CMU. He was at the DEC Research Center, DEC Cambridge. He's been around. He has a long list of recognitions. I won't enumerate all of them. Too many awards to enumerate, including the Gödel Prize, which is very dear to my heart. The ISCA Influential Award, which I will never get. The IEEE Wallace McDowell Award. Fulbright Chair, ACM Fellow, member of National Academy of Engineering, National Academy of Inventors, and so on and so forth. And he has agreed today to come and tell us about blockchain. And listen carefully, he's going to offer you Bitcoin investing advice. Let's welcome Maurice Herlihy.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm sure you've all heard a lot about Bitcoin. And I became interested in this maybe 2 years ago. And this has this property that is just the most fascinating field I've been in. Before this, I was doing cache coherence protocol, which is really boring. But once you get into this kind of area, you just can't look away. And I don't mean I can't look away in a nice sense. It's like driving down the freeway and you see there's a terrible accident on the other side of the road, and you sort of keep looking at it, even though you know you're a bad person for doing that. And the whole Bitcoin blockchain public face is a little bit like that. Now, a lot of the fascination with the public with blockchain and Bitcoin, a lot of it is just plain naked greed. So this is a graph of the price of Bitcoin itself. As you can see, up until last summer, it was going up. And I knew all these obnoxious people who were telling me how they were getting rich and I wasn't. Most of them fell strangely silent after that. But it's a field that just appeals to our natural desire to make lots of money with very little effort. Now that the price of Bitcoin is down, some of my friends are mean to me and they say, you totally miscalculated working in this area. It's crypto winter now. It's obviously over. People are onto you, and we recognize that this is all a big fraud. But in fact, this is what happens with every technical idea. You can think virtual memory. You can think garbage collection. The idea is invented. People go crazy over it and they say, well, this is going to solve everything. Then they realize, well, actually life is complicated. We've replaced one set of problems with another set of problems that are just as hard. And now I'm angry and betrayed, and I feel used because I bought in so enthusiastically in this field. And then there's a reaction and everybody rejects the field. Then after that, people do a lot of much less dramatic, boring, normal science. And things get better. People publish incremental papers in conferences. And gradually the field becomes both respectable and kind of boring. People don't have long arguments about virtual memory anymore. When I was a grad student, I had a workstation in my office that was like the size of a washing machine. And when it was paging, it sounded like a washing machine. It was shaking back and forth. Most people don't even notice when their laptops are paging. It's not considered interesting enough to observe. So when Bitcoin was high, we were there. Bitcoin today is down here, and our mission is to slowly bring this field, out of the tabloid headlines and into scientific respectability. So most people first probably heard about Bitcoin when they heard about the Silk Road. Silk Road was the place to go on the darknet to buy drugs, weapons, and assassins for hire. And each of those things actually was sold. These things were sold for Bitcoin, which was the only sort of choice at the time. It was considered hard to trace. And this means that Bitcoin is forever associated in many people's minds with crime and sleaze and so on. There's still some truth to that. There's all kinds of dramatic stories about exchanges, unregulated banks that took people's money and vanished. The first one was Mt. Gox. Just last week, the largest cryptocurrency exchange in Canada, the owner apparently dropped dead and didn't leave instructions on how to get to all the Bitcoins. And the thing about Bitcoin is you lose the key, that's gone. Now, since then, the fever swamps of the Twitter crypto world are reporting that maybe he didn't actually die, maybe he faked his death, maybe it was all a big Ponzi scheme. There are suspicious patterns of movements of coins that shouldn't be moving. I mean, I don't know what the truth is, but really, this is so much more entertaining than cash coherence. Another kind of comic opera aspect of this is who invented Bitcoin? So Bitcoin was allegedly invented by someone or some people who called themselves Satoshi Nakamoto, which is apparently a very common male Japanese name. We don't know much about who that is. There are all kinds of people listed as being suspects. The paper mixes American spelling and British spelling, probably just to confuse the people. And every now and then, people show up claiming to be this person. You know, a little bit like, you remember the Princess Anastasia was allegedly, killed during the Bolshevik Revolution, but then she reappears, and several people show up claiming to be her. You know, the Lost Dauphin, other great imposters. And it's still the case that nobody knows who this person is, but every now and then we can have some fun reading these tabloid headlines. Right now, Bitcoin is used mostly for kind of unsavory activities. Nobody buys a pizza with a Bitcoin. I mean, I think there's a place in Palo Alto that will sell you a pizza for Bitcoin, but it's a stunt. Basically, if you're selling something where you don't want too much scrutiny, then cryptocurrencies sort of do the trick, but not really. So I don't know whether you can read that in the back, but one side says tacos and the other says tacos on the blockchain. And so this is kind of the halo effect, where no matter what you do, if you add blockchain to it, it instantly becomes way more exciting. So, this concludes the kind of lurid, sensationalistic part of the talk. Now that I've have your attention, what I want to point out is that blockchains, not so much Bitcoin, but blockchains, are a serious, scientific and engineering activity. That is, the techniques behind these things are worth studying and worth understanding and worth deploying, despite the fact that it's surrounded by all of this hype and grift and fraud and other kinds of things that you wouldn't want your relatives to know you were associated with. That there is real scientific value to what's going on, which is totally unrelated to this week's price of this cryptocurrency or another. Now, this is my view of where this fits in. So the history of distributed computing is to a large extent the history of what kinds of failures you want to tolerate, which is usually kind of formalized as saying, well, we have an adversary. So in classical distributed computing, the adversary could control timing. Messages show up late. They show up out of order. Crashes. We need to replicate our databases because the adversary can crash 1 out of 3 of our copies. Omission failures, there's all kinds of technical things. At the most extreme, you have Byzantine failures, where we have some device that fails in a way we can't quite predict, so we call it Byzantine and kind of pretend that it's malicious, but really we know that it's not actually malicious. Now, where I see the blockchain world fitting in is that the adversaries have changed and the problems we want to deal with have changed. So this is today's adversary. It's a person sitting in some cafe somewhere who's reading your code and realizing that they'll be rich beyond their wildest dreams if they can find a bug. This is far more challenging than trying to figure out whether some avionics device is going to have all 0 failures and so on. The subtlety of the bugs has gone way up. These are very subtle bugs that you can't really protect against because you didn't know they existed or even had names at the time you wrote your code, and then a year later somebody says, I can use side channel attacks to figure out your secret key that you thought was secured safely in your enclave. And the challenges that we're trying to deal with are also way more challenging. Now, the reason to look at blockchains is blockchains kind of epitomizes this. If blockchains go away tomorrow, I don't think they will, but if they did, it would still be the case that dealing with this kind of adversary is what modern distributed computing should be working with. And blockchains are a convenient and exciting place to attack this, but it isn't about blockchain so much as it is about how to figure out how to take a group of parties that don't trust each other and make it possible for them to cooperate with mutual advantage in such a way that honest parties can't be cheated. So this is the paper that started the Bitcoin fuss. And it illustrates something that we all know but should be reminded of from time to time, is that real innovation in the technical community usually comes from the margins. Established people are too busy doing incremental improvements on their previous results because we all want to go to the same conference and we want to impress our friends. And I really like shaving a log factor off of my frenemies' results so I can go and lord it over him until he turns around and does the same thing next year. So you're not likely to do something that's really wild and radical because it's too risky, and besides, they're lower hanging fruit. So you can ask whether this paper would have been accepted if it had been submitted to a mainstream distributed computing conference. And we don't know the answer because it never was accepted. But I know if I were a typical referee, I would look at this and say, there's no theorems, there's no experiments. The correctness arguments are kind of unconvincing, and besides, didn't cite my thesis. There's only a small number of kind of random citations. So it's quite possible that this would have been rejected by the mainstream establishment. And of course, now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And none of the papers that were accepted can claim to have sparked a billion-dollar industry. Whatever you think of the merits of the industry, it's there. And what I want to claim here is that a lot of what's going on here isn't as new as it looks. That a lot of this is rediscovered or repurposed distributed computing. And the way to think about this and the way to understand this is to approach it through the classical notions that distributed computing has been working on for a long time now. So this is the way I like to think about this. The blockchain universe is a kind of a weird alternative universe to the distributed computing universe. That is, we can recognize things. It's like looking at South American birds. I can recognize analogs of North American birds, but they're kind of mutated in strange ways. Sometimes trivial and sometimes not trivial. But viewing the world as the blockchain world as an alternate universe to a familiar world, I think is the best way to understand what's going on. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these things, drawing the analogs, and explain how one could be understood better if you understand the other. Now, there's a classical Star Trek episode. For those of you who didn't grow up in the United States, Star Trek was a cheesy science fiction series that was on TV during, I think it was probably the 70s. And 60s. And many of us grew up on it, but I realized the need to set the cultural. And there's one classic episode where.
Miro.
What's it?
Miro, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Miro.
So here, Kirk, the captain, and Spock, his first officer, go to a alternate universe where they meet their evil doppelgangers. And you can tell they're evil because Spock is wearing a beard. And Kirk is wearing a muscle shirt. These are universal signifiers of evil in 1960s America, so you don't need any explanation to know that these are bad guys. And so this is what so think of blockchain as sort of the bad boys of distributed computing. But really, I want to claim that they're more alike than you would think. Now, I became interested in this when I actually read the original Stellar network paper. Stellar had just raised $1 zillion in funding. They had a Byzantine agreement white paper. The first page made it clear they had no idea what Byzantine agreement was. That paper's since been suppressed. Their current white paper, which they claim is the only one there ever was, makes perfect sense. It was written by a Stanford professor. But their early work is, there were a lot of technical failures. These mostly don't happen nowadays, but in the early days, people just couldn't seem to get things right. Now, I don't mean to be kind of overly snarky, but we do know how to do a lot of things that the early blockchain people didn't do, but we didn't do them. So, I think as much as I'm going to complain about the lack of knowledge and depth in a lot of the work that's done in blockchain startups these days, it's still the case that they went out and they built this billion-dollar economy, and we just published papers. Okay, so the basic idea, there's a lot of obfuscation and needless complication around blockchains, but a blockchain is just a ledger. A ledger is an invention of the Italian Renaissance where you keep track of events. So it's an append-only list of events. Being append-only is important because it says you never go back and change something. If you put something wrong on the ledger, you don't erase it, you correct it by writing a compensating entry. And this makes it very hard to steal things from the ledger. It makes it hard to embezzle money because there's a record of everything that ever happened. Now, it's important to realize, despite its name, that a ledger doesn't have to be financial information. It could be a database log. It could be a message queue. It's any abstraction whose state is determined by a sequence of events can be represented as a ledger, and in principle can be represented as a blockchain. So the other ingredient is that the parties who share the ledger don't necessarily trust one another. But there are clear, unambiguous rules for determining what is on the ledger. So that even though you and I might not trust each other one little bit, we have a protocol for figuring out what's on the ledger. And if there's a disagreement, it's because one party is not acting in good faith. So I don't need to trust you to know what's supposed to be on the ledger, and vice versa. And accordingly, it's tamper proof. That is, if somebody tries to go back and change a bit, then that will be detected, and everyone will universally recognize, wait a second, there's something broken here. So what, at the heart of a lot of distributed computing is a problem called consensus, and at the heart of at least Bitcoin is something called proof of work. Proof of work is not the only way to do business, but it's the only one I'm going to have time to talk about. So blockchain, the abstraction it represents is a ledger, but literally it's this list where you have a record of something that happened, and it contains a pointer to the previous thing that happened. So what happened? There's a linear sequence of events. There are forms of blockchain where you have partial order instead of total order. I'm not going to talk about that, but for our purposes, it's just a sequence of events. So we want to make this tamper proof. We'll take something called the cryptographic hash function. I'm not going to tell you sort of the mathematical properties, but the idea is that I can take something, I can take a hash of it, and going in one direction is easy, going in the other direction is hard. So I can take a document, hash it, and if I give you the hash, you can't reconstruct the document. But I could, for example, prove that I had this document this morning. I give you the hash this morning. In the afternoon, I can give you the document. You can hash it and say, yes, they match. You must have had this document this morning. So we can use hashes to make things tamper-proof by including in each event the hash of the previous event, and indirectly the hash of the event before that, and so on. And so this is the only idea that you need to understand as far as making blockchains tamper-proof. So this is an idea that's been around since forever. Big one? I think it was Merkel, or probably somebody invented it before Merkel. I'm not sure. I think there are people here who probably know more about the history than I do. So if somebody tampers with it, then the hashes don't match. And if the hashes don't match here, they're not going to match here either. So you change one bit arbitrarily in any arbitrary place, and the whole thing is going to collapse. We can represent this even more literally, go down kind of a level of abstraction, and say, well, the vertical part is the ledger. It's a linear sequence of things that happen. There are things that want to happen, and they come in, and then there's something that does consensus to figure out what happens. And the consensus is where all of the complicated concurrency, fault-tolerant stuff goes in. The rest is just sort of simple elementary data structures. I didn't put the hashes on this thing because I didn't want to clutter the... So we have the operations that want to happen come in some order. They're ordered by consensus, and then we produce the linear sequence of things that happened. Now, turns out that there was a blockchain before the word blockchain was invented. So the New York Times has had a blockchain since 1995. This is a company that will hash documents. So let's say you're working in your industrial lab and you invent an anti-gravity device. So eventually you're going to want to patent it, but you don't want to patent it right away, but you want to prove that you had knowledge of the anti-gravity device on February 5th, 2019. So you hash the document, and now I have a hash that proves that I had the document. And remember, you can't go the other way and reconstruct the document from the hash. So I'm going to store the documents on a secure server, and then every day I'm going to publish the hash to the New York Times Lost and Found. And this is an actual picture of one of those hashes. So later, if there's a lawsuit, somebody's challenging my patent, says you could not possibly have invented your anti-gravity device back in 2019, I can bring a copy of the New York Times, show them the hash, show them my lab notes. You can hash that lab notes, and that's proof that I had the idea at the time. And this is most of the functionality of an actual blockchain. Somebody pointed out that you could attack this by printing millions of fake copies of the New York Times for the date with a different hash, but that would be expensive. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about applications of blockchains. What can you actually do with them? So our friend Alice has a frozen yogurt business, but her business is in trouble. Why is this? Well, the shipments of yogurt to her factory keep showing up melted, and she doesn't know what to do. So she looks at her supply chain. Her supply chain consists of, in this idealized world, Bob's trucking company, which carries the yogurt for her, and Carol's factory, which manufactures the yogurt. And the problem is that when they're unloaded off of Bob's truck, they're often melted. So she confronts Bob, and Bob has lots of excuses. And he basically says, you can't prove that it's my fault, and I refuse to accept responsibility. Carol says the same thing. So now Alice needs a way to figure out who is responsible for this melted yogurt. So she says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the ledger in the cloud somewhere. I'm going to rent storage from Amazon or Google. I'm going to buy a bunch of temperature sensors and put them in the trucks. And I'm going to ask Bob and Carol to sign over custody with their digital signatures when they transfer the yogurt. And so what happens is we'll have a record of all of the temperatures. The sensor readings will come in. We'll do consensus to figure out what order to put them in. Now, of course, there's nothing magical about this. If Bob drops his sensors in a bucket of dry ice, then Alice is going to be fooled, because you need some kind of common sense correspondence between the software system and the real world. But that's not unique to blockchains. Then the next step is that when custody is transferred, when Bob picks up a yogurt shipment from Carol, Carol signs saying, I'm handing this to Bob, and Bob signs saying, I'm accepting this from Carol. And that goes onto the blockchain as well. And so at this point, Alice can figure out exactly what went wrong and knows whom to blame. And moreover, you can take that to a judge and explain what's going on if you wanted to sue someone. So this corresponds to what people often call a public or permissionless or permissioned blockchain. Okay, so the next kind of thing that people want to do with blockchains is illustrated by Alice, who sells her frozen yogurt business now that she's solvent again. And she decides to open a restaurant. And the problem with restaurants is that they're capital intensive. You've got to buy a deep fryer, you've got to buy a silverware and stuff like that. And raising money through a venture is expensive. The capitalists want control. So she decides she's going to raise money by going to the public. And well, she can't actually do literally an initial coin offering because those are now essentially illegal. So she says, okay, I'm going to create a coupon. The idea here is you give me money now. When my restaurant is up and running, after I've invested your money, I'm going to give you a discount meal. This is sometimes called the utility token in the jargon. So I'm not selling you a security because you have no voting rights. I'm selling you a promise of future services. I'm not going to give you investment advice, but don't try this unless you have a really good lawyer because Securities and Exchange Commission still doesn't like this stuff. So Alice, being media savvy, calls this a crypto coupon. What's that? ICOs are now deemed to be securities offerings. So they're not illegal, but you better be a licensed securities trader to do it. And if you're a licensed security trader, then that's kind of expensive. So if you're sitting if you're a kid in a garage somewhere, this is kind of out of reach. So it's still very a tricky area because it's extremely murky what is and is not legal. So again, your crypto coupon gives you discount meals when the restaurant opens. So a little bit of cryptography. I'm sure you all know this, but I'm going to race through it just so that we're all on the same page. So everybody has a public key and a private key. If Alice takes plain text and encrypts it with her public key, then only she can read it. So in particular, anybody can send a message to Alice and only Alice can read that. If we reverse the polarity, Alice can encrypt things with a private key, and anybody else can decrypt them with a public key, and you know that only Alice could have produced this, so that's the digital signature. So public key, private key, symmetries and asymmetries play an essential role in the blockchain world. And the best way to explain this is by the well-known legend of King Arthur. This would be better if I had a BBC accent, but it says, "Whosoever pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England." Okay, so the sword is a public key. The sword is out there for everybody to see, and anybody can touch the sword and try to pull it out. But the sword is sort of the public statement of this is what you need to do in order to be recognized. The ability to pull the sword out of the stone is the private key, because presumably only the rightwise born king of England can do that, namely Arthur. So the ability to pull the sword is Arthur's private key, is sort of his superpower. So your private key is your superpower. The public key is how people recognize that you have this superpower. And what does this give you right to do? Well, it gives you right to be king. So we have a public key, which everyone can see. We have a private key that only the rightful heir controls. And we have something that this allows you to do. And this is exactly the ingredients that we need to set up a blockchain. So when Alice creates a coupon, she puts this entry on the ledger. And don't worry too hard about reading the sort of legalese here. But it basically says that the fact that this is on the ledger means it's authoritative, means you should pay attention to it. You know, anybody can create certificates and so on, but if it's not on the blockchain, then you should ignore it. You list the public key. Again, that's like the sword. The public key says this is the goal. This is the obstacle. This is what you need to the problem that you need to address to be recognized. If you know the private key, then you own the coupon. So if I can demonstrate I control the private key, then I control the coupon. What can I do with the coupon? Well, I can, since I own it, I can transfer it to someone else. I can sell it or spend it. If I want to spend a coupon, I do a similar kind of entry on the blockchain. So what I say is, again, the public key. This is the public key that controls the coupon. You can check and see that that public key matches the public key of a coupon creation in the blockchain so that the ledger is coherent. Knowledge of the private key conveys ownership. That means I'm authorized to change ownership. And what I can do, once I've established my ownership, is I can transfer that coupon to someone else. How do I identify them? By their public key. And then everything links together in this way. And if somebody offers you a coupon, you can trace through and make sure that they really own the coupon. Okay, now we get to the clever part. So Alice doesn't want to host this blockchain in her basement because electricity bills are high. Customers might not trust her. You know, she might pull the plug and spill Dr. Pepper on her disk drive, that sort of thing. So she says, I have an idea. I'm going to outsource blockchain management. I'm going to convince other people to do the work for me. In order to do the work of maintaining my coupon-bearing blockchain, I need to pay people. What am I going to pay them in? More coupons. This is the Ponzi scheme brilliance of the idea, that I'm going to profit from producing these coupons, and I'm going to get you to do the work by paying you even more of these coupons. So if you believe these coupons have value, then it's worthwhile. I'm going to leave off the counterpositive. So she pays them with more coupons. So the longer you work here, the more coupons you make. Who controls the blockchain? Well, you could do this in a centralized way, the same way that Visa and MasterCard control most of our commerce. This is ideologically unacceptable to a lot of the people who work in blockchains. We won't get into that too much. They prefer something that's decentralized, where you have voters. And the idea is that you might be able to corrupt one or two of the judges, like the one in the middle there, but you can't corrupt the majority. So that raises the technical question, how do we go about voting? So we can go around asking people to vote, but we don't actually know who's out there. And some of the people who are out there might not be what they first appear to be. So in classical distributed computing, consensus is basically synonymous with some form of voting. You can have elaborate rules about how you decide how to vote, but it's still everybody in the end gets to vote. But in this world, though, things are a lot more complicated. So this is the picture of the Delphic Sibyl on Sistine Chapel ceiling. I'm trying to convey the idea of something called the Sibyl attack. Now, the Sibyl and Sibyl attack and the Sibyl in classical literature have nothing to do with each other, but I didn't know what other picture to use. So the thing about Sibyl is Sibyl likes to vote. In fact, she likes to vote a little bit too much. So naively, you might say, okay, so anybody who wants to participate, you can vote according to IP address. But it's easy to write a program that generates a zillion IP addresses And it looks like there's a tidal wave of support for something out there when it's really all the one James Bond villain who's controlling all of these votes. So we have the property that we don't really have identities, and yet we need to conduct some kind of voting. So we need a signal that's hard to fake. So this is something that sociologists have studied a lot, and they call it costly signaling. So the idea here is you want to convince somebody you're qualified to do something. You do something that would be really expensive if you weren't sincere. So let's say you're running a street gang. Problem is, somebody comes along and says, I'd like to join your gang. How do you know they're not an undercover police officer? How do you know they're not a journalist? How do you know they're not some kind of lazy good-for-nothing? Well, you ask them to do something like get a gang tattoo, which is really expensive, and nobody's going to do this unless they really, really are sincere. In evolution, one way to signal to a mate that your genes are good is you do something that otherwise would attract predators, like you have a great big flashy tail, or you have oversized antlers. You might belong to a subculture and you're really irritated about these weekend high school kids who come in and pretend to belong to your culture. So you kind of raise standards for what it takes to really belong. So you do things that no casual high school student would bring themselves to do as a kind of barrier to entry. So this is the nature of proof of work, that you ask people to do something that is so stupid and expensive that they're not going to do this unless they're really kind of dedicated to running your blockchain. So I'm not going to go into the technicalities of proof of work. Proof of work, by the way, was invented long before blockchains. It was invented as a way of destroying spam. The idea there is you solve a little puzzle every time you send an email. It costs a fraction of a cent if you send a dozen emails. It costs you a lot more if you send a billion emails. Unfortunately, this never caught on, and we're the worst for it. So this is the closest I'm going to get to an actual technical explanation. So basically, you hold a lottery over who gets to decide what's on the blockchain next. Tickets are expensive. You pay a lot of money for a lottery ticket. If you win, you get paid. If you lose, tough luck, try again. You only get paid if later players endorse what you did. So that means that you have an incentive to do something that will be acceptable to most of your peers. So there's an incentive in there to not cheat too much. And Sybil attacks are expensive and pointless because if all your sock puppets buy tickets, then it's not really Sybil attack anymore. Now there is a problem that sometimes multiple miners can win the lottery simultaneously. It happens on a regular basis, not too much. And at that point, it's a tie. And so the later miners will just pick one or the other to build on, and eventually one of them becomes longer and more established, and the other one dies out and it's ignored. As a result, though, you can't trust anything you see on the blockchain. The technical term is it lacks finality. So if I see something at the end of the blockchain, it might go away. If I see that something has been built upon by others, then it becomes exponentially less likely to go away. So if I'm selling you a cappuccino, I might give you the cappuccino after one or two others have built on it. If I'm selling you a Lamborghini, I'm going to wait until 10 others have built on it. This is one of the reasons why Bitcoin is slow. Now, again, I talk about this as if it were consensus, but classical consensus, the kind that people like me have know and love, there's always one kind of unique winner. Everybody proposes something, everyone agrees, we'll pick option number 2. Whereas we've seen in proof of work consensus, there can be multiple winners. Again, not too often, but it's not a catastrophe when this happens. It's just an annoyance. So these are differences. Consensus once reached is permanent. Proof of work consensus, on the other hand, emerges only over time. So it is consensus, but it's consensus in this kind of mutant, strange way. Okay, so the last few minutes I'll talk about another related subject, another place where if people had only known elementary things about programming languages and concurrency, they could have saved a lot of grief and pain. if they bought my textbook, then they'd be better off. So a smart contract is basically a script that runs on the blockchain. A smart contract is not a contract and it's not smart, but it is a brilliant marketing term. You just think of it as a shell script that works on blockchain transactions. So a contract looks like an object in an object-oriented programming language. You've all seen this before. Don't worry too much about what the details of the code does say. You can just sort of soak it all in. Pretty much a contract manages a long-lived state. So this is a contract that does some kind of voting. And this maps voters to their preferences. Contract exports functions, same way an object exports methods. So you can create a contract on the blockchain, you can call a function exported by a contract. And contracts can call each other's functions the same way that objects can call one another's methods. So on the surface, this looks like a kind of boring, small talk-like object-oriented language, except it's written in JavaScript. So the model looks single-threaded. Contracts are executed sequentially by the miners, before they do consensus, and re-executed sequentially by everyone afterwards to check that they did it correctly, because nobody, of course, trusts anyone else. There's no concurrency, so no worries. Now, here's a classic application. So the DAO stands for Distributed Autonomous Organization. It was a hedge fund with no managers. It was, in 2016, it was created. People put like $50 million plus capital in it. And the idea is you would put money in, and then the shareholders would vote on where to invest it. They would submit proposals, people would vote. All the voting would be handled by smart contracts. There'd be no humans in the loop, just consumers. And the claim is, code is, we don't need courts, we don't need police, we don't need lawyers, we don't need most of civilization because we have code. Code is law. So you and I agree on something, we both read the code, and of course we totally understand the implications of the code. We agree on this and we have an irrevocable deal. The code executes. Whatever the code does, we agreed to it. So we don't need lawyers to litigate anything. I don't need a policeman to come and arrest you if you violate the contract because it's automatically self-executing. And this is how we're going to arrive at some kind of a libertarian utopia. When this came out, there was a lot of press hyperventilation. They said, isn't this wonderful? All of those blood-sucking Wall Street, rent-seeking parasites are going to be driving Ubers and Lyfts, ha ha. And let's look a little bit at some of their code. So this is a method that allows someone to withdraw their own money. The green arrow is the program counter. So you call this method, and then say, okay, so which client wants their money back? Does the client have enough money? Yes, they do. Now I'm going to transfer the money by making a call to the client's contract, saying, here's your money, and then I'm going to debit their account. And this is what happens. So I've already shown you in those 6 lines of code everything you need to know to realize that this is a disaster. Now, I think most of you, unless you've seen this before, probably missed it. So let's rewind. So here, I'm calling the contract and say, here's your money. So the program counter goes down to the other contract, says, okay, here's your money. I'm going to increment my account, and then does something weird. Instead of returning, it makes a re-entrant call back to the top-level contract, which is perfectly legal, although kind of strange. And so now, the program counter moves back up. Now notice there's something weird going on here. Now we have 2 program counters executing the same code with the same shared state. So the fact is that everyone was saying there is no concurrency. There is concurrency here. There's this is completely standard, monitor and monitor like concurrency. But the people who did this had never apparently done any work in this area, and they totally missed this. And what happens? Well, you get down here and say, does the client have enough money? Of course the client has enough money because we haven't decremented the counter yet. And so, yep, the client has enough money. Here's your money again. And again and again. And so you can drain all the money out of the account this way. It stops when your stack depth reaches 1024, because that's the built-in limit. And this actually happened. So the contract I showed you was a slightly cleaned up version of the actual contract, but the logic was exactly the same. Those 6 lines are all you need to know. If you had perfect computational resources, you could have looked at this and said, whoa, that's broken. And in fact, to this day, nobody knows who did this. What did they do to fix this? Well, they rebooted the currency. They did what's called the hard fork. They said, okay, we're going to go back and we're going to change the rules. We're going to create a new currency, which we'll also call Ethereum. The diehards would take the old Ethereum and call it Ethereum Classic and run their own ship. Why is this? Well, because if you had made a mistake and lost 50 million of your own money, well, welcome to the libertarian paradise. If you steal 50 from the people who actually secretly are in control of things, then that's a different story. So you should not buy for an instant the claim that any of this is a decentralized, libertarian, or any of this thing. There's a social network around this that says that henceforth we are going to ignore the old Ethereum and we're going to create a new Ethereum and we're going to call this new, pretend that was the same thing all along. Now, I'm not saying they did the wrong thing. I'm not saying I would have done anything differently. But you should be, when you listen to the ideological rhetoric surrounding this, you should realize that there's a big gap between what the true believers will tell you and real life. Okay, people would say, oh wow, this is just because we've never seen this before. But in fact, this is a monitor invariant. If you think of this contract as a monitor, there's a monitor invariant has to be restored before you release the lock. The reenter call means you basically release the lock without restoring the invariant. And if anyone did this in my undergraduate class, they would get a bad grade. And we would notice. Okay, so now I've sort of hinted that behind all of it, one of the things that makes this fun is behind all of this, there's a lot of ideological drive, which is, from a technical point of view, is totally irrelevant. I don't care what the motivations of the people who invented this are. But the ideals driving this are, at least in some cases, sort of laudable. So the idea that censorship resistance says that neither Visa nor the government nor any other large organization can stop us from doing commerce if we decide. So you can't blacklist somebody. If I want to send money to Iran, I can do that without the government interfering. If I want to send money to a dissident political group in a place where the government doesn't like that, I can't be prevented from doing that. Trust-free society says that instead of having centralized trust, like Visa and MasterCard and even Facebook, have what you might call surveillance capitalism. They make their money because they know who is trustworthy and who isn't. They know before they're going to give you a credit card, they're going to make sure that you're good at credit risk. But we're giving a lot of power to these non-politically appointed entities, these corporations, and we would like to kind of decentralize that. So we don't need, in the original Bitcoin vision, we didn't need Visa and MasterCard. And code is law basically says we want to get rid of lawyers, and who could argue that that's a bad thing? But as we've seen, it's like a lot of 20th century ideologies, it sounds great on paper, but when you try to execute it, things get very complicated and somewhat nasty fairly quickly. And so part of the problem is that we don't really understand what our code does. I showed you those 6 lines of code. which if you, understood the complete semantics of solidity, you should say, whoa, that, reentrancy attack. And the people who wrote this code, the people who did the DAO were the people who basically invented Ethereum. So they were, and probably still are, the world's expert at this sort of thing, and yet they missed the fact that their 6-line code was going to lose somebody $50 million. So, pretty much no matter what you do, you can probably find a place in the blockchain world where what you do can be used to make people's money more secure. You could verify that smart contracts do what they're supposed to do and are not vulnerable to this attack. And there are many, many other even more subtle attacks. I've got 2 weeks worth of lectures in my undergraduate class talking about different ways you can, complete with historic examples of how you can steal money from people by exploiting bugs and weird semantics in the language and runtime. Okay, so in conclusion, despite the fact that there's a lot of smoke mirrors, fraud, and so on in the blockchain world, blockchains are here to stay, and they are going to have a long-term impact on society. Maybe not the ones that we expect, maybe not as soon as we expect. It's a cliche that technologies, everyone always overestimates the short-term impact of a technology and underestimates the long-term. And I think that's completely the case here. But blockchains are going to change the world, maybe not in a dramatic way. Maybe it just means that we'll be able to figure out which lettuce is poisonous this week. But it's still going to have a broad effect. The way to understand the blockchain world is to kind of see through the changes in terminology and the hype and say, well, this is really just distributed computing that's given a kind of a twist. That if you really want to understand how these things work, you're better off starting out with kind of standard issue distributed or concurrent computing and then moving that into the blockchain world than you are trying to understand the usual kind of Bitcoin tutorial. That may vary according to your taste and background, but certainly that's the way that I would do things. And as a research area, I think this is a very fruitful thing that we could all work on. Again, don't be put off by the kind of loose nature of what you read in the newspapers. There are a lot of, I think, very deep scientific issues and engineering issues and even mathematical issues hiding in this area. And because of the hype and so on, it's easy to get students to work on this. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple of questions, so think about your questions.
So if Alice just wanted to give the visa to run the blockchain, okay, she'll have to pay the money, we don't understand how it works, but she wants to be fully distributed. That means that other people will have to do computing.
Yes.
And in the current world, the only way that will motivate them is that they have to make some crypto money. And so right now it seems to me is that blockchain and cryptocurrency are connected at the hip. And I don't know if there's any way to really separate these two twins and make blockchain respectable while dismissing cryptocurrency.
So public blockchains where anyone can participate, you need a kind of a native currency to incentivize people. Private blockchains, so imagine that my hedge fund and your hedge fund want to run a dark pool, and we don't trust each other, but we'll set up a private blockchain between us. I don't need cryptocurrency there. I give you a server, someone who works for me, and you have a server who works for you, and we rent a server from someone else to break ties. So in this kind of walled garden model, you don't need to incentivize, you just pay people to do things on your behalf. In the public case, you do need some kind of internal currency that's worth something, and even in the restaurant case, you're concerned with, if you were doing the restaurant coupons for real on Ethereum, then you would be paying the miners in Ethereum and you'd be paying your investors in coupons. So yeah, you do need native currency, but that doesn't necessarily make things sleazy. It just makes your tax accountant very unhappy.
Just makes
your tax accountant very unhappy. if you have earnings in cryptocurrency.
Any other questions? Here.
Could you comment on how you think the proof of stake versus proof of work thing will shake out? Will proof of stake restrict itself to permission blockchains, and proof of work will remain for permissionless, or will Algorand and Avalanche and these take over?
I cannot. Proof of work is such a crime against the planet. I can't believe it's going to keep going. But I also don't see how it's going to go away anytime soon, because being decentralized is hard to shut it down. But I think there are forms of proof of stake, presumably, that do work in a permissionless world. They haven't really been tested. Ethereum wants to switch to a proof of stake, and they keep postponing when they do this, because it's a little bit like dismantling the engines on a plane while it's flying. But I think proof of work is nobody is going to do a new currency based on proof of work, certainly not a company, because they would be vilified in the press for this. So I think proof of work is eventually going to fade away because everybody hates it. But the speed with which that happens is going to be harder to predict.
Any other questions? If not, join me in thanking our speaker.